In episode 15 of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, the Wandenreich's invasion of Soul Society is completed. HITSUGAYA and Soi Fon take on Bazz-B and BG9, and Ichigo's training takes him down an unexpected path. With the second Quincy invasion now truly underway, this is when things are going to get very interesting in this adaptation, and where I think we'll really start to see what shape this version of the 1,000-Year Blood War is going to take, and I believe we're already seeing those changes begin to bear fruit. That becomes particularly apparent in the next episode, but here in episode 15, Peace from Shadows, we already get treated to plenty of new content, new scenes, and teases of changes to come. So let's just dive right in. As always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to say a massive shout out and an enormous thank you to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. And again, I want to say another massive thank you for all of your support as we just try and play catch up this week to make up for the episodes that I missed while I was away. Before we get into the review, we have to take a look, as always, at what was covered in this week's episode. This episode is a little more straightforward than the previous one, though I'd argue less linear in its presentation still than anything we got in the first core, continuing the trend of this core being adapted in a very liberal and almost free-flowing way, and that's very exciting. As someone who knows this arc inside and out, the way they're changing it up is perhaps the most exciting part of all for me. Anyway, in this week's episode, there were 5 chapters looked at. We have chapter 547, Peace from Shadows, which of course is the episode's title, chapter 548, The Thin Ice, 549, The Stormbringer, 550, Blazing Bullets, and finally chapter 551, The Burnt Offerings. But despite the fact we just reeled off the 5 chapters this episode covers, we won't be starting with any of them, because the episode begins with another brand new scene, the Sternritter's villainous meeting from the original trailer. I am very happy to see this. As someone who does love and really enjoy the Sternritter, but also felt that many of them didn't get their due time to shine, I am so happy to see them appear in a more expansive capacity, no matter what form that may take. And while this scene doesn't really bring anything new in regards to the plot to the table, in fact it basically exists to reiterate 2 points that are brought up later on anyway, it is great to have. Now, yes, it is a shameless copy of the Espada meeting, but as I said before, if they're going to introduce these villains to a whole new generation of fans, it makes sense, I think, to take cues from some of Bleach's most popular and recognisable scenes, images, and entities. Plus, I mean, visually, I think this scene looks wonderful, and it is very cool to see almost all of the Sternritter here, minus the Schutzstaffel. Characters like Pepe and Nyanzol make another appearance here, way beyond when they'll actually get involved, which is the kind of foreshadowing many of the Sternritter simply lacked in the source material. At least now, newer fans can catch a glimpse of Nyanzol and think, he looks kind of interesting, I wonder when he might show up in the future, as opposed to Nyanzol just showing up almost out of nowhere as he did in the original source material. Now, this meeting of theirs takes place in the Vortlik Hall, a new location within Silburn. Now, Google Translate tells me that Vortlik means literally, and Vort just means word. However, I'd like to defer to a comment on my live reaction of episode 15 left by Urahara Kisuke 1329. Of course, Urahara would be the one to bring the answers, but this commenter notes that Vortlik effectively translates into the English idiom word by word. I love this. The word-by-word hall is a strange but fitting name, as the Sternritter each embody a schrift, a holy word. So it's just a cool reference to the Sternritter and the fact that they are sitting alphabetically, so thank you again, Urahara Kisuke 1329. Speaking of which, they fixed their error from last week and seem to have finally learnt the alphabet, as masked masculine Sternritter S is now correctly placed between Sternritter T and P, Candice and Meninas respectively. The first two Sternritter to speak during the meeting are none other than Robert Acatrone and BG9, which feels very on the nose to me, as they're the only two that never had their schrift revealed. That being said, as of episode 16, we're rapidly running out of time to actually learn BG9's schrift, so maybe this doesn't mean anything at all. Robert questions what the point is in them killing the captains with the bankai they stole from them, to which BG9 adds that surely their soldat are enough to defeat the captains who no longer have bankai, which is funny to think about and almost certainly not true. Hashwolf tells them, however, that they also need to crush the Shinigami's hope, as the captains will train to fight without bankai and then still go on to believe that they can win without it. We then see that amazing shot from the trailer as the camera pans out, revealing the entirety of that bone-white table, and it shows all of the Sternritter sitting alongside it, and the episode title displayed on the table itself. Unlike some previous title drops, this one doesn't really reflect the original chapter title's appearance at all. Asnot then says that the plan sounds disturbing and therefore fun, after which Bambietta says she plans on killing Komamura and anyone else who gets in her way anyway. The upside-down angle of her leaning back on her chair could be a quick reference to the fact that she faces Shinji in the following episode, or it could just be a coincidence. The meeting ends with Yugrum telling everyone to annihilate the enemy instantly. So yeah, the meeting tells us three things: that they plan to kill the captains with the stolen bankai, that Yhwach predicts the captains will learn to fight without bankai, and that their orders are to annihilate the enemy instantly. All of these points are delivered separately in the source material, and two of them will be reiterated later anyway. But regardless, I do love this scene. It's ominous, it embodies the Espada meeting of old for a bit of fun nostalgia, and it gives us a chance to see more of the Sternritter, and therefore, it's a win in my book. Once the opening is done, the episode begins a few pages into chapter 547. We skip over the additional shots of Seireitei being transformed, which is a bit of a shame, as it did all happen quite fast in the last episode, as well as the shocked expressions of several important Shinigami. The episode actually opens with Kione and Sentaro rushing to Ukitake, who is seated before a shrine, as they see what's going on from afar. The shot of Ukitake is far clearer here than it is in the source material. Afterwards, we go backwards a few pages again to the shot of Kyoraku and Nanao surveying the new landscape. As we move on through the chaos of the transformation, the structure is changed up again. 2 pages featuring the research and development department freaking out over the transformation are cut, showing the shadows glossing over them and removing their instruments right before their very eyes. Instead, we move beyond that, right to Yhwach's explanation of what's actually going on. Unlike the source material, where Yhwach is still standing atop the palace, this time he's now seated in his throne with Uryu beside him. Yhwach explains that 1,000 years ago the Quincy's lost the war against the Shinigami, which of course we already know. With no other option, however, they then fled their empire in the world of the living and hid in the one place the Shinigami wouldn't expect, Seireitei itself. This kind of explains the disappearance of Yhwach's empire on Earth, the Lichtreich, but it is a bit weird nonetheless, and this goes for the explanation in the source material too. The Lichtreich were defeated in Seireitei, at least so far as we know, at least so far as we have seen, and not the world of the living. So presumably after Yhwach was heavily injured by Yamamoto and the battle was lost, they fled and simply decided against against going back to the human world and disappeared into the Seireitei instead, unless the Quincy fled into the human world and the Gotei 13 gave chase to finish them off for good, at which point the Quincy decided to spin back around and go into Seireitei. Yhwach then reveals they used their dominion over Reishi to create spaces within the shadows of the Seireitei itself, transforming the Lichtreich, what was once known as the Empire of Light, into the Wandenreich, the Invisible Empire. It's an awesome reveal, and definitely one of the most impressive and powerful feats performed by any being or race in the series, and it's exactly the sort of crazy shenanigans I want to see from the Quincy's, who are masters of Reishi control in a way that just no other race in the series are. Now, like I mentioned, the structure around this explanation is a little bit different compared to the source material, because following on originally from the Research and Development Institute disappearing, Hyosu screams, "What the hell is happening?" To which Yhwach seemingly answers him by saying, "You will never know," and then following on with his explanation. However, here, Yhwach says "you will never know" to kind of no one, and instead Hyosu's moment comes after the explanation instead. Askin, yes, then appears in the space where the Research and Development Department was, just as he did in the source material, explaining that unlike the human world, Soul Society is so abundant with Reishi, it means the things they can do were totally limitless. And as such, they've spent 1,000 years building their strength from within the shadows of Soul Society itself. Askin then receives his splash screen here a few chapters after he does in the source material. And by the way, splash screens in this core are now blue rather than pink to fit this season's new colour scheme. Yugrum then confronts Kyoraku and Nanao, explaining that just like last time, they didn't invade by breaking through the Shakon Maku, they were already inside it. This whole explanation sequence is handled very well, I think, and the atmosphere and mood is perfectly dark and ominous. Characters like Hashwolf and Askin look very sinister with the icy cold blue lighting over their faces, and the music is a low, eerie tune that works perfectly as these villains quite literally emerge from the shadows, revealing that they have been watching our heroes the entire time. Anyway, Hashwolf also gets his splash screen here as well. Basically, all of the Sternritter name drops have been moved from chapters 543 and 544 and spread out across their introductions in the battle, which does make sense to me. Kyoraku's conversation with Yugrum is identical to the original chapter, and I love how it's portrayed as being so frosty here in the anime. There's no music at all, it's very threatening, and both Yugrum and Kyoraku look cold and menacing, with only the glint of their eyes visible beneath the veil of shadows. It is funny though how the order was to annihilate the enemy immediately. That didn't really work out for them. The scene in the former 12th Division continues as Askin mocks the Research and Development Shinigami for being intelligent in name only, confirming once and for all that the Quincy have been here the whole time. Mayuri's hidden lab then appears behind Askin, gleaming with a brilliant bright light. Mayuri's face appears first through the door, a funny little addition that did get a good laugh out of me on my first watch, before he emerges in his amazing sun suit. I really like the effects of the sunsuit in the anime. I think it looks absolutely fantastic, and it's one of the best examples of how the detail in the anime was improved so much from that initial teaser trailer we got at the end of the first core. Now, unfortunately, Akon's aghast expression is cut, but apart from that, this whole sequence is very faithful to the source material, leading up to Mayuri challenging Askin at the end, as he explains that he modified his personal lab to not have any shadows. We then get a new sequence showing the Shinigami and the Soldat clashing on the changed landscape. I'm not a huge fan of the intense shaky cam that goes on during this, but I will say I love to see this regardless. As I've recanted numerous times before, involving the foot soldiers helps to make this not only feel like a war, but feel much bigger in scope than anything that's come before. This wouldn't be just a battle between Captain and Sternritter, but also between regular officer and regular soldat, each and every one of them fighting for their lives. And it just adds a little bit more to the rest of the scenes as well. For example, it's cool seeing Bazz-B blasting the Shinigami with flames like he does in the chapter, but this time he's flanked by Soldat as well, before ordering them off to their targets in the midst of battle. It helps to make the Sternritter also appear like commanding officers. Frankly, it's a great addition, and then this is followed by Bazz-B's splash screen too. And here we reach the end of chapter 547 as HITSUGAYA arrives to save the Shinigami, blocking Bazz-B's flames. As we enter chapter 548, things shift around again a bit. HITSUGAYA and Bazz-B's interaction continues immediately, pushing Omaeda's scene to a little bit later on. HITSUGAYA and Bazz-B's introduction, however, plays out the same as it does in the chapter, with Bazz-B's flames looking really effective here. I think they're animated beautifully. Also, for that extra punch of nostalgia, this scene features a nice remix of On the Precipice of Defeat. Easily one of the most iconic soundtracks in Bleach history, in my opinion. We then return to Omaeda's scene from the opening of the chapter. While this scene plays out mostly the same as before, it removes elements of Omaeda being terrified in a continued bid to make him seem more like a hero than he really is. However, his monologue to his little sister Moreo is the same as the source material, and the voice actor for Omaeda does a really good job of making Omaeda sound resolute in his determination to protect the Seirete and actually do his job for once as an officer of the Gotei 13. It does a great job of showing you that Omaeda has come so far since the first time we saw him, and now he understands the responsibility that he shoulders as well as the burden of protection that comes with it. But we'll talk more about Omaeda and his portrayal in general when we reach his next scene. For now, BG9 comes crashing into the alleyway and receives his splash screen, which also shows his glowing eye, which I think is a cool little detail. But a new shot of Uryu ominously surveying the battlefield concludes roughly the first half of the episode or so. As the second half of the episode begins, we continue the battle between HITSUGAYA, Matsumoto, and Bazz-B, from chapter 548. Rangiku tells the surrounding officers to fall back before Bazz-B tries to blast her with flame in a new shot, but HITSUGAYA defends her. A small dialogue between two of the officers below is cut from the episode where they worry that HITSUGAYA isn't up to the task due to how thin his ice is. However, a new interaction between HITSUGAYA and Bazz-B is included here. In the original chapter, Bazz-B simply tries to catch HITSUGAYA in the air with his flame, but here HITSUGAYA lands in front of him. Bazz-B grabs a chunk of ice and crushes it, telling HITSUGAYA to beg for mercy. However, HITSUGAYA counters with his mysterious line from the trailer, saying why would the winning side beg for mercy, leading to Bazz-B trying to blast him again as he calls him cocky. I actually really appreciate the anime giving them a little more of a back and forth, and Bazz-B's voice actor is doing a phenomenal job with this character in the heat of battle. As HITSUGAYA and Matsumoto carry out Operation Mille-Feuille using HITSUGAYA's ice combined with layers of Heineko's ash to create a vacuum shield, this sequence is very similar all around to the source, except in the anime Rangiku gives most of the explanation regarding the tactic instead of HITSUGAYA. As HITSUGAYA then summons and drives a blade of vacuum ice into Bazz-B, chapter 548 ends. The ice blade is far more explosive and powerful looking in the anime than it is in the source material, but both of them still pin Bazz-B to a pillar. As we move into chapter 549, the scene showing the officers celebrating HITSUGAYA's supposed victory is cut, and their dialogue about taking on the Quincy without bankai is given to Rangiku instead. So far, that's a few scenes now involving the random officers that have been cut, which, like I said, is a shame as they are key to making this feel bigger in scope, but we will see them again in the future. Up next, however, we have quite a big structural change, as we're skipping over the entirety of both chapter 549 and 550 and going straight into the start of 551, featuring Kyoraku, Nanao, and Hashwolf. This scene plays out the exact same as the source material, right up until Nanao says it was a mistake for them to leave traces of their Reiatsu across the Seireitei in their last battle, at which point the scene is cut short and we're taken right the way back to the start of 549. It seems like this was probably done to introduce us to this conflict, so it can then be used as a bookmark when we return to it as events unfold in the other battles taking place, rather than placing it closer to the end of the battles with HITSUGAYA and Soi Fon altogether. Now, here's where things get interesting. Omaeda's initial encounter with BG9 is quite different from how it appears in the source material, but not necessarily due to time constraints or anything like that. It begins with Omaeda being stabbed by 3 of BG9's tendrils and slammed into the wall. Omaeda isn't actually stabbed by BG9 at all in the source material until a bit later on, after the inciting incident that changes this scene completely. And immediately after Omaeda is injured, we see another difference. Moreo, Omaeda's sister, is still here. She runs up to him, whereas in the source material she is already gone, and for good reason. Here in the episode though, Omaeda tells her to hide, but BG9 strikes the wall between them with a blade and asks where Soi Fon is. Unfortunately, a chunk of their conversation is removed here, including BG9 saying he searched the entirety of Seireitei and beyond using spiritual pressure samples he acquired in their last battle. BG9 on the whole seems a little diluted in the anime in comparison to his source version. In the original chapter, he's much more robotic in the way he continuously repeats that Omaeda is refusing to answer him. Now again, much like removing his cowardly nature earlier in the episode, this episode continues to go to lengths to portray Omaeda in a better light, removing his line where he says that if he knew where Soi Fon was, he's the kind of man who would probably give her up. However, as Omaeda tells BG9 that even if the Sternritter did find her, Soi Fon would never lose to him anyway, we get perhaps the most substantial and contentious change of the episode. In the anime, BG9 says that he will try to get it out of Omaeda a different way before turning to aim one of his tendrils at Moreo instead. As BG9 tries to strike her, a splatter of blood indicates that she's been hit, but instead Omaeda leapt in front of the strike, taking the injury instead. It is a valiant move from Omaeda, and he's able to save Moreo as a result. But this is vastly different in the source material. Again, BG9 says that he'll try to get Soi Fon's location out of Omaeda a different way before turning and firing a tendril into a nearby building. BG9 then rips his tendril through the building's ceiling as Omaeda wonders what he's up to, before suddenly the pin drops and Omaeda realises what's happened. Moreo has been skewered on the end of BG9's weapon. At this point, BG9 says that she must be Omaeda's family, and that the Shinigami doesn't need to answer that because although their physical appearance match ratio is low, their Reiatsu match ratio is over 50%. He then says that he detects several others with a similar match in the vicinity, before straight up warning Omaeda that every single one of them will die the moment he refuses to answer him again. However, completely consumed by a blinding rage, Omaeda slams Gagetsaburi into the side of BG9's head without a second thought, demanding the Quincy release his sister immediately. BG9, shrugging off the attack, simply says that he has 2 questions. First, can this be taken as a refusal to answer? And secondly, if he lets Moreo go now, she will lose a lot of blood and die. Is Omaeda alright with that happening? As he says this, he then just stabs Omaeda with his tendrils again, seemingly without a care in the world, which is what's so cool about this character in this scene, is that he is this faceless, statuesque robot, this terrifying Terminator who is so narrow-mindedly determined to get what he wants. But Omaeda isn't even listening anymore either and tries to attack BG9 again, but is stabbed once more. BG9 muses there's a chance Omaeda is in shock, and will give him 15 seconds to recuperate, but he expects an answer. Omaeda, however, totally unable to think clearly, simply rages that BG9 is a dead man, to which BG9 draws his Gatling gun and says, "That's unfortunate." In my opinion, both versions here have merit. In the anime, Omaeda comes across as heroic, selfless, and capable. This usually cowardly character shows real development by leaping in front of certain injury to protect his sister without hesitation. He also shows incredible speed as well, as BG9's tendrils do move very quickly. But that being said, I personally considerably prefer the version from the source material for a number of reasons. Firstly, like I said, the anime's version of BG9 as a character is very diluted, and BG9 doesn't get a lot of screen time as it is. I really enjoy how BG9 in the source material gets more dialogue and treats this traumatic event in such a callous, nonchalant, and straight-up fashion. The robotic nature of the character comes across much better when he details the Reiatsu match ratios of Omaeda's family, and how he keeps repeating, "I'm hoping for an answer," despite Omaeda's fury. Then there's Omaeda himself. Certainly the anime makes him look heroic, but I'd argue it's taken the easy way out. Omaeda still comes across as selfless and heroic in the source material, but in a much more desperate fashion. When BG9 destroys the building, we see that bumbling version of Omaeda until it all changes in an instant and realization washes over him. As soon as Omaeda sees Moreo, he becomes a different person entirely, someone we've never seen before, launching attack after attack at someone who is clearly much stronger than him. Omaeda, who is usually terrified and wanting to run away, keeps raging at BG9 despite being stabbed 3 or 4 times during their confrontation. At this point, he doesn't care about anything other than rescuing his sister, and is willing to stare death in the face, screaming at BG9 even as the Sternritter charges his minigun. Like I said, both versions have merit, and it's interesting to discuss why this change happened. Was it just to make Omaeda appear more heroic? Was it deemed too much to show a little girl being mortally wounded? Personally, I'm not sure it's that much different to Ururu being stabbed by Il Forte Grands in the Iran-Car arc, which admittedly was considerably toned down in the anime, and she was also a combatant momentarily as well. But then another part of making the Thousand Year Blood War feel more like a war is the inclusion of unwitting civilian casualties. These people don't want to be here, but they don't have a choice, and they're being caught up in the crossfire. In my opinion, it ramps up the stakes massively and helps to hammer home just how unfeeling and villainous BG9 is, and that even characters like Omaeda, who up until this point weren't shown to really care about anything except his own self-image and his wealth, actually has an emotional core as well, one that is also being threatened by the presence of the Quincy. Again, it is cool to see Omaeda being proactive rather than reactive in the anime, but overall I prefer the source material's version, but that's just me. Luckily, Soi Fon's excellent introduction is handled the same between the two versions. BG9 blasts Omaeda and Moreo with his gun, only for it to suddenly malfunction and explode. Soi Fon appears on the scene, having caught the bullets and then smashed the weapon itself using Shunko. As BG9 comments on Soi Fon's appearance, his line detailing what Shunko is, showcasing his knowledge, is cut from the episode. Their following conversation is changed slightly. In the source material, Soi Fon explains that she perfected her Shunko after her battle with Yoruichi, and since then has been working to strengthen it further. In the anime, BG9 questions if she was able to perfect it in such a short time. In the source material, Soi Fon goes on to explain how she improved her Shunko, detailing how she discovered a way to wrap herself in a vortex of spiritual pressure, thanking BG9 for taking her bankai, as that pushed her to improve her Shunko instead. This is removed from the anime. Soi Fon then appears in a blink of an eye beside BG9 and activates Mukyu Shunko, punching him in the chest with a massive barrel of wind energy. Now, I brought it up in my live reaction, so I won't belabor the point too much, but I do think Soi Fon Shunko looks better in the source material. Again, that's just going to be a subjective point of personal preference, but in my opinion, it's more voluminous, more pronounced, and actually takes the shape of very clear and obvious wings. It really looks like it is swirling tightly around her like a tornado suit of sorts, as opposed to just kind of blasting off her in the anime. But as Soi Fon slams her fist into BG9, a massive explosion goes off. But rather than continue with chapter 549, we jump to the start of chapter 550 in one of the most brutal cuts I've seen in the anime to date. There really was no time given to that blast to allow it to breathe. Now, a few people gave me some slack in my live reaction, claiming I missed Askin's scene altogether when I said that it had been cut, but that wasn't what I was referring to. I was just referring to this shot of Askin himself, which is one of my favourites, unfortunately being cut from the episode. Not the scene itself, of course, since it's playing out right at this point. And it's actually adapted extremely well. Interestingly, I think this scene is played more for laughs in the source material, but here it's a bit darker, a bit more serious, and a little bit more ominous. And I like both, to be honest. Because personally, I think that perfectly encapsulates Askin as a character. On the surface, he can be very jokey, very jovial, very light-hearted and silly, and not really look all that threatening, but in reality, at the flip of a switch, he does become very serious, very dangerous, and very devious. So I think that works really well. But the remainder of this scene does play out exactly the same, with Askin warning Mayuri that Yhwach has already predicted the Shinigami would have trained without bankai, and that it means things are still fatal for their side. Askin says fatal more often earlier on now too, alluding to his powers. Like I said, actually seeing Askin leave the site and Mayuri scowling at him makes the scene feel more desperate and definitely takes away some of that comedic element. We then return to the end of 549 as Matsumoto notices Soi Fon has seemingly won and asks HITSUGAYA if they should go and help someone else. However, as per the end of 549, Bazz-B reveals he's unharmed and hasn't even begun fighting yet. Carrying on into 550, Bazz-B confronts HITSUGAYA and Matsumoto once more. It's a bit of a shame that so many of the officer moments have been removed, like I said earlier, like them scared of the fact that Bazz-B is totally fine, but Bazz-B removes his cloak and prepares to fight. However, we then skip over the majority of 550 for now, returning to this fight towards the end of the chapter, where Bazz-B tells HITSUGAYA he only needs a finger to stop his ice. Bazz-B's dialogue regarding him cancelling out Yamamoto's flames has been cut from the episode, which I think is fine as that line just tended to invite a lot of debate. Now, as HITSUGAYA sends Rangiku away, we get a scene that I think a lot of us had been waiting for, Bazz-B's first burner finger 1 as chapter 550 comes to an end. I love that his gloves always have the speed arrows on them simply as part of their design, rather than them just almost randomly appearing as he heats up in preparation for the ability. It's a really cool attention to detail. Now, Burner Finger 1 looks and sounds amazing as Bazz-B fires it at HITSUGAYA, almost like a laser beam. It's wicked fast, and this is how it should have looked when Izuru was taken out in the first invasion. Although HITSUGAYA's ice wall defends against it for longer than in the source material, Burner Finger 1 eventually punches through it, striking the captain in the chest. Unfortunately, as we move back to Soi Fon vs BG9, one of my favourite cliffhangers of the arc from 549 is removed, which featured Soi Fon walking away from the dust and rubble of her attack, only for BG9 to appear in the mist behind her with his glowing eye. Instead, here he just tries to strike her with a tendril immediately, only for Soi Fon to spin round and grab it. It's slightly less impressive a manoeuvre than in the original chapter where she backflips over it and grabs it, but it is still very cool. As BG9 emerges now uncloaked, I was very happy to see they left in his best line about how he has never taken a breath, but Soi Fon's follow-up is removed where she kind of confirms him to be a robot. The animation of BG9 revealing his missiles is very well done, and as he explains that he received valuable data on Mukyu Shunko, we see blue lights beginning to converge around him. Now either this is simply him charging up his missiles, or it's a hint towards his shrift and him gathering data. It's really cool as well that his eye blinks into life the moment he blasts Soi Fon with his missiles, completely decimating the area. As Soi Fon escapes the ball of fire, BG9 immediately pierces her wrist. His line where he reiterates that he gained useful data on Mukyu Shunko is gone, but it just means he immediately learned that a Shinigami's Reiatsu leaks from their wrists, and in stabbing her there, he shut off that power. But I adore how this is presented in the anime. I really do love it. That terrifying music blaring as Soi Fon looks on in horror at BG9, who has appeared in front of her instantly as he then detonates another explosion at point-blank range. I was personally never quite sure what actually happened here, as in the original chapter you can't really tell, and a weird line seems to run from BG9's eye prior to the blast, and I was never sure what that meant, if anything. But I think it's likely that he just unloads another barrage of missiles, again this time at point-blank range. I don't think it can be understated how quickly Soi Fon is defeated by BG9 here. Their whole fight is over in like 3 moves, but regardless, this scene is just handled so very well. But we then reach the final part of the episode, the last half of 551. Hashwolf's next scene, which again, like I said, is bookending some of the fighting, is kept the same here as the chapter, and we then move on to the culmination of Toshiro versus Bazz-B. Now this also plays out virtually identically to the source material. Bazz-B gives chase, slicing through Toshiro's ice, though there's a nice new detail of HITSUGAYA freezing the wound that he received from Burner Finger 1. For whatever reason, the speed arrows don't appear on Bazz-B's shoes when he uses Burning Stomp in the anime, however. As Bazz-B dominates HITSUGAYA, an awesome remix of What Can You See in Their Eyes is playing, which everyone helpfully reminded me most famously plays not during the Ion fight, but during Ichigo vs Ulquiorra, which I totally forgot. Anyway, Bazz-B uses Burner Finger 2 on HITSUGAYA after escaping the captain's trap, ending the fight. Burner Finger 2 looks a lot more visually impressive in the source material, I think, where it results in an enormous explosion, and HITSUGAYA looks well and truly in horror as he's hit by this blinding attack that really looks like it scorches him in an extremely painful way, though it does work very well in the anime too. I really love the angle of us following Burner Finger 2 as it barrels through HITSUGAYA's ice wall, lights up his face, and then slices him down the front. Either way, it's all very well done. But as Toshiro lies now dying on the ground, Kangdu arrives to finish him off, as per Yuha Bak's instructions. And the episode ends with Mayuri receiving a call from Kisuke telling him he's discovered a way to restore the stolen bankai, the cliffhanger of chapter 551. Except that's not the end, because there's a fascinating post-credits scene to talk about. One thing I will say is that so far, post-credit scenes are being handled far better in this core than they were in the previous one, where in this core they are so far just small, tantalizing addendums to the episode. In core 1 they sometimes included like the second half of the entire episode, it felt like, so this is much better. Ichigo continues his walk down this strange, mystical pathway as Ichibei recites an incantation of sorts, or even a prayer. It begins but does not end. Names wither in the silence. In an abyss of rolling clouds, raindrops fill an empty vessel. Those who are unworthy to become a vessel succumb to its weight as it turns to stone. It breaks apart and turns to gravel. Pounding rain reduces it to dust. For such a vessel, there is no way out. Those who are about to perish call it Irazu Sando. Irazu Sando roughly translates to the unapproachable path, and this is a brand new concept being introduced that simply wasn't in the source material at all. There's a lot of theories about what all of this means, and we'll discuss it some more in the next review, as what happens in episode 16 is even more exciting. Whether Ichibei is describing the process of Ichigo's own training, which seems to be taking place on the literal version of the unapproachable path itself, or, as I'm wondering, if Ichibei is describing perhaps the existence of the Soul King himself. It begins, but doesn't end. Names wither in silence, as you imagine the Soul King has perhaps forgotten how to speak, or has lost his voice after eons of imprisonment, or if he has simply forgotten all of those who once used to mean something to him. In an abyss of rolling clouds, up in the heavens of the royal palace, perhaps. It all sounds to me like the Soul King's never-ending heavenly torment, but there is more to discuss, and we'll do so in the next video. And then the poem for this week's episode features Bambietta Bastabine, and it reads, "I will splatter your life on the wall, just like I do with love." I mean, in my opinion, it sounds fairly straightforward. Bambietta kills the people she sleeps with like a black widow of sorts. Personally, I don't think it's that deep. I think it's just kind of here to say that she's a very destructive person, basically, that even when it comes to love, she's very violent, and that same violence carries over into how she attacks people, how she fights and battles as well. That's what I think, but of course there could be a lot more to it than that, but to me this seems like one of the more straightforward ones. And then it's revealed, of course, that episode 16 is the fundamental virulence, which we will get into next. No predictions this week, that would be a little bit unfair as I've already seen episode 16, but regardless, I really hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of episode 15, Peace from Shadows. And again, just as with the live reaction, I really appreciate you checking this video out, even though it is quite late at this point, but I'm still in the process of playing catch-up, but we're nearly there. We've nearly managed to catch up everything to do with the anime before episode 17 comes out. I have a feeling that I will probably release the review for episode 16, and then episode 17's live reaction will come perhaps a day after it comes out, just so there can be a little bit of breathing room between the videos, but we'll see how things go. Either way, as of next week, we will be basically totally caught up, so I really do appreciate all of your support. On the whole, I thought this was a pretty good episode, a great start to the actual second invasion of the Quincy. In my opinion, of the 3 episodes released so far, this is maybe the weakest, but I think they've been a fairly strong bunch on the whole, and I did like how both fights were presented. I think, again, it's important to remember that none of these fights are the big important ones. Toshiro versus Bazz-B, Soi Fon versus BG9, Toshiro versus Kangdu. These aren't major important fights in the second invasion. These are just the fights that kind of get the ball rolling, which is a bit of a shame because it does mean characters like BG9 and Kangdu are swiftly forgotten about after this. But I think the anime's done a great job of making these fights look, honestly, pretty nice considering they are of lesser importance overall. I think that's something to keep in mind. I'm hoping, like we've said before, the big fights coming up will hopefully look great. But yeah, I thought this episode was pretty good on the whole. There's still a lot of jumping around, there's still a lot of cut content, but there's also a lot of new content as well. I think maybe this episode had perhaps less, it certainly has less new content than the next episode, maybe about the same as episode 14, but things I love, like the Sternritter meeting, always great to see stuff like that. But let me know all of your thoughts on this episode, all of the new additions, everything it took away down in the comments below. Did you enjoy the battle between Toshiro and Bazz-B and Soi Fon and BG9? What did you think of the changes to Omaeda's big moment? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, guys, and until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.